Hi everybody, and welcome to my presentation about ADHD and the impacts that it has on my creative process. Today, I hope to show you how a neurodiverse person, in this case me, deals with the creative process and how my neurodiversity affects it. My name's Tyler Smith, and I have ADHD. I was diagnosed when I was 27 years old, and for the past 3 years I've had many revelations about how my ADHD impacts my life and my work. Before we get started, I'd like to just take a moment to thank you all for joining this talk. I know that mental health and neurodiversity can be a very difficult topic to talk about, believe me, and to hear about, and so I really appreciate you joining me. I'd also like to extend a special thanks to the Write the Docs conference for hosting this talk, as well as to GitHub, my company, for supporting a presentation on this subject. I'd like to begin this presentation by giving you an insight into my experience with ADHD and what that's like for me. I'm going to preface all of this by saying that the experiences that I'm going to share with you aren't necessarily representative of every single person with ADHD. These are mostly my own experiences. My ADHD diagnosis happened when I was 27 years old. That's a pretty late diagnosis for something that's especially usually diagnosed in childhood. And a big reason for that is that I was misdiagnosed 3 times with bipolar and depression and also anxiety. Bipolar is a much more common diagnosis for adults, and it shares some big similarities with ADHD. It's actually quite a common misdiagnosis that's made. After my diagnosis and when I started treatment, I sort of figured out that my anxiety and depression are mostly caused by my ADHD. They're not quite so separate as it was first thought. And it also feels kind of wrong to talk about all of this without at least making a mention that there are many misconceptions surrounding ADHD that I've heard since my diagnosis. That particular topic is more than likely something I could do a whole presentation on, but I'm not here to do that, so that's maybe for another time. So, at this point, I'm going to take some time to give you an example of something that really changed heavily once I'd started treating my ADHD. My hope with this is that I can really drive home for you how sort of world-shifting it really is. To start to set the scene for you, it was October 1st, and I just started a new job around a month beforehand, and I was in that job looking after a bunch of office technology across a bunch of different buildings. The day before, I'd been at an ADHD clinic all day, getting tests and diagnoses, doing interviews, and I'd gotten some medication from there to begin to try and tamp down the effects of my ADHD. So, at around 4 p.m, I was stood at the reception desk with one of the people who worked on reception, and we were having a conversation with somebody who worked in one of the offices in the building. To be honest, I don't 100% remember what the conversation was about. It was a long time ago, but suffice it to say that the 3 of us were all involved in this conversation, me as well. And suddenly, I hear my laptop go off next to me, and somebody had sent me a message about a printer that was broken in another one of the buildings that I was responsible for. So I started working on it with the person who messaged me, remoted into the printer, tested some things, had them confirm some things, started printing out some test pages for them. That wasn't working, so we did a few more things, and eventually we printed out a test page, and it worked. All in all, that took about 20 minutes, and 20 minutes later, I sort of looked up, and the 2 people who I'd been in a conversation with were still there, and they were still having a conversation. What they were talking about, though, again, I can't really remember what the topic was and what it had changed to, but it had definitely changed to something entirely different. It was still the same conversation with the same 2 people, but the topic had shifted, and for the first time in 27 years, I had no idea what their conversation was about. You see, for 27 years, regardless of how much I tried to concentrate on something, I could never fully focus on what was in front of me. I was always aware of everything around me. I was always hearing any other conversations, always noticing, let's say, if somebody walked past, or if a garbage truck was going by the window on the street, or if somebody was over on the canal in Amsterdam. I just have to have a look at it. I feel a need to look at it and see what it was and notice, and there was just something that made that happen in my mind. A little later on, I sat down with the same colleague and we had a little conversation about this. I explained what I've just explained there, and her response was that she looked at me a little bit strange and just said, I don't understand, what do you mean? So I tried to explain it again, and how this was such a strange thing for me. And she looked at me again, and the words that she said were, but that's just normal. Well, it wasn't normal to me. And I explained that I'd spent 27 years of my life never having that feeling, never knowing what that felt like, never being able to fully focus on one thing without noticing all of the other things around me. And that was just the first day of my medication. Now, you may be wondering, probably rightly so, what all of that has to do with the subject of my presentation about working methods and ADHD. I promise that it does have a purpose. In fact, it serves a dual purpose. I chose this specific story to share with all of you among the very many stories that I have, because it provides a very vivid example of how profoundly impactful ADHD can be on a person. This is something that I have shared with many people, and it's usually the story that I go to explain how impactful it is on me and in my life. The second part of the reason is that it's going to make the next slide make so much more sense, because you have a real physical example of what I'm talking about. And the next slide especially is, or the next few slides, should I say, are really vital to my central point, the central thesis to what I want to really hone in on today. So I'd like to talk through a metaphor that I came up with, and I feel, again, it's important here to emphasize that this metaphor was created by me and based on my own experiences. I have talked to several other people about this to see if they gain an understanding from it and see if it makes sense as just a metaphor as it is. And also with a few people with ADHD as well, to see that it resonates with them too. And for the most part, it really has. This is something that a lot of people seem to be able to relate to. But again, it doesn't necessarily apply to every single person with ADHD. Just because we have a label of ADHD, just because there is a diagnosis there, that doesn't necessarily mean that all of us have exactly the same experience with ADHD. We're all unique people, and it affects us in very different ways. But now, onto the metaphor, and I call this metaphor the buckets. What are the buckets? For me, this became apparent after I started taking my medication. When I did start, I noticed lots of things, like the story I just shared, being able to focus on things without noticing everything around me. That seemed to just go away with my medication. And on the back of this, I made quite a poor assumption, but also quite a common assumption, that all of the bad things about me would also go away with my medication. I was wrong. I was very wrong on that. What I've realized at this point, by going through those experiences, is that there are 3 buckets of things. And I'll explain what those are. The first bucket is things that are a part of a person and that aren't at all affected by ADHD. And this could be any number of things, but it's very difficult to pin down what your ADHD doesn't impact. For me, it's things like I love to read. That's something that my ADHD has very little to no effect on, to be honest. It doesn't make me like it more. It doesn't make me like it less. It doesn't make it, it sometimes makes it more difficult. But all in all, I like to read. I like to write. These things aren't really impacted by my ADHD. The fact that I like them isn't impacted at all by my ADHD. The second bucket is things that are wholly caused by ADHD. And this is where the story that I told you about being distracted and noticing things all the time, that's where that falls. In addition to that, things like time management, things like impulsivity and spending money where I really don't need to spend money, those things all fall within the bucket of things that are almost entirely, if not absolutely wholly, caused by ADHD. For a lot of people, these are the two buckets that exist. And what I've discovered is there is actually another bucket. It's in the middle of these two things. This last bucket is things about a person, whether they're personality traits, whether they're habits, or something else entirely, that are affected by ADHD, but aren't necessarily caused by it. When I take my medication, the effects of the ADHD go away, but the trait or habit in that bucket still remains. You see, as a good example of this, medication for ADHD doesn't take away one's ability to procrastinate. I can still procrastinate just fine with or without my medication. What it does is it takes away the unconscious focus shift that can happen whilst procrastinating, which is something that ADHD causes. If I'm trying, or not necessarily trying, but if I am procrastinating on something, my ADHD lets me focus shift away, focus on something else entirely, and helps me to just forget that that thing's there. Then I'm no longer really procrastinating on it. I am, but indirectly. That makes it much easier to actually procrastinate because your focus is elsewhere and you're not thinking about it. And again, because it's indirect procrastination. But with the medication, when that effect is taken away, procrastination becomes active. But it doesn't go away. And that's why it falls into the middle bucket. So what does all of this have to do with my work and my working process? And why am I talking about it here? Well, a few months ago, Write the Docs put out a call for proposals. I had one in mind about how ADHD affects my working process, given that I'd been having some conversations about that very topic with other people who have ADHD, my manager, and several other people. So I decided to submit that as a proposal. A few weeks later, I got an email that my proposal had been accepted by Write the Docs, which is why I'm here. But then that got me thinking. I take medication to take away the effects of my ADHD and to try and give me a more neurotypical day-to-day experience. So, having thought about that, does that mean I shouldn't be talking about this? Does it discount my experience completely? Well, no, not really, it doesn't. You remember the buckets? More specifically, I'm referring to the ADHD affected bucket, the one that's in the middle. This is where my working process really comes into play. You see, my working process is a habit. It's something that I've done for a long time, and I've built it up over a long time. And I spent 27 years building that working process throughout school, throughout my studies, throughout all of the jobs that I've had. I've been working in technology for over 10 years now, and I spent a long time building up the habits around work. And a lot of those habits were impacted by my ADHD, some extremely heavily impacted. But when you take the ADHD away, the working process doesn't necessarily change. It falls into this strange middle bucket, this ADHD affected bucket, where it's a habit because I've done it, and I developed the habit because of my ADHD, largely because of my ADHD, because I have to work around certain things in order to get my work done properly whilst I have ADHD. And as with all of the things that are in this ADHD affected bucket, with my working process, I first assessed it and asked myself, is it possible to change this process? And the answer to that was yes. Of course, it's possible to change that process. It's a habit. It takes some time. But I then stopped and asked myself a much more important question. Is it necessary to change that process? Now, I'd like to explain my working process and hopefully help you understand what all of the past few slides mean to me specifically. And to explain that working process, I'd like to talk through one more metaphor. I know it's a lot of metaphors and it's quite abstract, but this is the best way that I've found that I can explain things without keeping you for hours and hours and hours and giving you a bunch of vivid examples. So this metaphor is about drawing a line. So what does that mean? Well, we can start by thinking about the task of, let's say, writing 30 documents as somebody asking you, instead of them asking you to write 30 documents, they ask you to draw a line. And they give you some things that you have to follow in order to draw that line properly and have the task completed. Firstly, the line needs to be straight. It needs to be as straight as possible. It can be drawn incrementally, it doesn't have to be all at once, but it should be as straight as possible by the end of it. The line needs to be exactly 30 centimeters long. I choose 30 centimeters for two big reasons. One of them is because it fits nicely with 1 centimeter per document. It needs to be absolutely no more and absolutely no less. It needs to be exactly 30 centimeters. You're given 30 days to complete this task. Now, of course, I'll ask you to suspend your disbelief on this a little bit. I know 30 centimeters is a very quick line to draw, but I'll ask you to just imagine with me that, on average, it may take you a whole day to complete a 1 centimeter section of the line fully, which is why you have 30 days to complete this task. So, I'm going to start with a sort of neurotypical process, a process that may not fit with everybody, but something that might be one of many normal processes. And I bring this not to try and pigeonhole the normal processes, but to give you a point of reference to compare with the process of my work, which I'll describe to you after this. Obviously, it has a lot of variance, but I imagine that it's something along these lines. So I say most people, but somebody neurotypical might do the following is probably a better way of wording that. So first, they'd work out that it's usually possible in a normal day to do 1 centimeter per day. They'd, investigate that, look into it, realize, yeah, that's about the right conclusion. Next, they might grab their piece of paper and very roughly draw a 1 centimeter line. Draw it very lightly on the page so you can barely see it and it's easy to get rid of. Maybe use a pencil for that. Essentially, just give an outline of the 1 centimeter. This is approximately how long it needs to be and where it needs to go on the paper. Then they might spend some time researching what 1 centimeters in length looks like. Give the outline a little bit more attention, bring it closer, make it clearer on the page. Maybe find a guide for 1 centimeter so they can measure it, make sure that it does actually fit the bill, and continue to edit the line. And with that, by the end of the day, there's an extra 1 centimeters added to the line, and it's firm, full, clear, and there. And then you can start each new day at that point looking at the line on the paper, and if it's right in the middle of the paper, you can choose the left side or the right side. Or if it's really close to one of the edges of the paper, you know which side you have to go to, because you know that a full 1 centimeter line isn't going to fit on that side anymore. And maybe sometimes the piece of paper is running out of space and there's 0.5 centimeter on one side and 0.8 centimeters on the other side, and you need a 1 centimeter line. So you can take a 0.3 and a 0.7 and you're not over the edges of the paper, but you have your full 1 centimeter line on there. Now, I'd like to talk you through the process of how I do things. And again, this is my experience, but I've spoken to multiple people about this, and many people do seem to resonate with it and understand it from their point of view too. So here would be my approach given the metaphor. The first 28 or 29 days, the vast majority of the time, would be researching absolutely everything. And what that means is I find myself a 30 centimeter ruler, and then I'd probably go to great lengths to find a bunch more 30 centimeter rulers and put them all next to each other, and whichever one has the most matches, I know is probably the closest to 30 centimeters and is going to be almost exactly correct. Then I'm going to look at the page and I'm going to start like moving my ruler around the page, and I'm going to, look at it from as many angles as I can. I'm going to put it widthways, I'm going to put it lengthways, I'm going to put it up at the top of the paper, down at the bottom of the paper, maybe diagonally across the paper to make sure I know all of the information, make sure I know where the line fits and how the line would look on the page once it's done. And then look at whether we could add more lines later. And then I identify a start point and the end point in my mind on the paper based on all of the measurements that I've taken. I then grab all of my tools, grab a pencil and sharpen it, take a pen, make sure there's enough ink in there, test it, make sure it's not going to break under any stress just in case, and have a bunch of backup options ready. So if I am using a pencil, I grab 3, 5, 7 pencils, make sure they're all sharp, make sure they're all ready, and make sure the colour matches. The same thing with pens, make sure that if I've got a blue pen, then I have a bunch more blue pens, and if it's a black pen, then I have a bunch more black pens, and all of them have ink, and I've tested them out on some scrap paper and made sure that they work, and I put them against the ruler and make sure that they actually draw a line against the ruler and there's no kinks or anything like that. And then I ruminate some more on where that 30 centimeters needs to go across the page. You see, I identified where it should go in my mind, but I need some time to think about that, to imagine what that's going to look like, and to maybe imagine a better way. Maybe I didn't think of the diagonal before. Maybe I didn't think of rotating the page before. But going through those things in my mind to ruminate, to figure out what the best way to draw a line on this piece of paper is. And then I'd physically measure it a bunch more times just to make sure it fits and looks like I think it should look like and how I've imagined it looks like. And then finally, on the last day or two, I draw the entire line in one. Or maybe if it's 2 days, I draw half the line and then draw another half of the line. Now, what does this all mean? What conclusions can we draw from this? Well, both results, you end up with a 30 centimeter line or 30 documents in whatever structure it is that they're going to. And whilst it might seem wasteful to take so much time in the beginning doing all of that research and grabbing everything, realistically all of the research time was exactly the same amount of time as a whole. It's just that in the first method it happens frequently and sporadically between the actual line drawing, or outside of the metaphor, the content writing. The first method is, of course, much more iterative across a much larger task. If you have 60 documents to write, the first one is much more iterative. You have one document, you have 5 documents in a week, and you send those out, and they continuously are coming out. The second method, however, can still work for singular documents. It just needs to be on a much smaller scale and to meet that faster cadence. You just have to break it down into more smaller tasks and not give one huge large number. And the most important point that I really want to drive home here is this one. The efficiency level is completely different with both methods depending on how you look at it. Both methods have an average efficiency of 30 documents per 30 days, or 1 per day, if you look at it from a 30-day period. The first method, however, has a comparable week-to-week efficiency. In 7 days, you write 7 documents. And week 1 is going to be approximately 7 documents, maybe it's 6, whereas week 2 is 7 or 8 documents, and you get an average of 7 documents per week. The second one won't have that if you look at it week to week. So, what's the point of all of this? Well, I got to this presentation subject because this exact situation actually happened to me. I had a task to take control of an entire knowledge base. Without giving you too many details, it ended up that I had to completely restructure and rewrite almost all of the knowledge base. And I have a couple of charts here to demonstrate a couple of things. Now, I've fudged the numbers a little bit to make them look nice on graphs and have them broken down on a month-to-month average instead of, weekly averages. But also because a research percentage is a very difficult thing to quantify, especially for a project in which I wasn't focused on trying to quantify the research percentage. The key points to make here are that during the first 4 months, only 2 documents get written. But the research level goes up to 95% complete. And then in the last 2 months, the last 5% of research is completed with 3% in month 5 and 2% in month 6, equaling 100%. Whilst inversely, the total number of documents written absolutely flies up. The difference in averages here is quite astounding. 4 months of having 0.5 documents per month written versus 2 months of having an average of 64 documents written per month. Now, once again, these numbers are slightly fudged for the sake of a more visual example, as well as using only a small number of data points. The real situation was a case of over 30 documents per week on average over a period of 3 weeks, with several months and a bunch of other projects and distractions beforehand having much lower average numbers of documents written. And the point that I really want to drive home here is that I ask myself the question about efficiency. If I can be as efficient as writing 64 documents on average per month, or in my real example, 30 documents per week, why can't I just do that every week? And that's what led me to this entire example. And with those numbers, I went and spoke to my manager about my working process and my understanding of my working process as I understood it more and more. And that conversation really helped my manager to understand where I was coming from and how my working process works and why my numbers might look very different. So, what advice can I give, having talked you through all of this? Well, I'll start with some advice for neurodiverse people, and not necessarily just ADHD people. The first major thing to say is try and take some time to discover your working process and really begin to understand it and how it might be different from other people's working processes. If there are people around you who you feel comfortable sharing details about your neurodiversity with, I would absolutely recommend doing so. It's helped me so much, especially after finding a group of people at GitHub who also identify as neurodiverse, and being involved in that community has been fantastic for me. Try to make allowances for your working methods. It can be difficult, believe me, I know that. But when you understand how you work, you can change the way you intake work to allow for your process to succeed. It's also worth mentioning here that you should also try not to punish yourself for not succeeding every time. It will be a work in progress for a while. And finally, if you find others who identify as neurodiverse in your circles, be as supportive to them as you'd like everybody to be towards you. Build a community if you can, and help each other. And finally, just some advice for the non-neurodiverse people, or neurotypical people. I hope this presentation has done enough to show you that there are different ways of working that might be completely different to what you might expect. There are definitely more than I've shown here, and recognizing this is an incredible first step. When you do come across somebody who works differently to the way you do, try and show understanding that their working methods might be different, their numbers may look skewed in certain ways, and there might be reasons behind that. Take time to try and understand their process. If someone does come to you with some personal information, whether it be about neurodiversity or something completely different, keep that information between you and the person you talk to about it without the permission of the other person. Whether it's somebody with neurodiversity or not, it costs nothing to be excellent to people. This sort of ties in with every point above in both advice sections. Being good to people builds trust and strong foundations for relationships, whether it's colleagues, friends, or strangers. Thank you for listening to my presentation today. I sincerely hope that you found this helpful. I'll be attending the live Q&A session a little later on if you have any questions you'd like to ask me. I'm also not a huge social media user, but if you would like to connect with me outside of this conference, you can find me on LinkedIn by searching for my name. Thank you, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference.
I feel like that you gotta a really kind of overwhelming reception in chat. I feel like there was a whole lot of like feeling seen and appreciation and everything. And so I just wanted to say, thank you from everyone kind of in audio form as well for kind of coming forward and giving the talk. And yeah, I think it was really well received, I would say.
Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody in the chat. It's a very difficult subject to talk about sometimes.
Yeah, no, and I think people really appreciated that. And I even saw somebody who was like, I decided to come to the conference just for this talk. So, know that, that impact is there as well, right? People are really appreciating it. And it did seem like it was just a really wonderful kind of almost like manager's guide to understanding your employee kind of thing. And there was a few questions that people had. One of the ones that I was kind of curious about kind of starting with is just kind of like if you found kind of management techniques that work well. I think somebody in particular asked, did sprints help? Did different timeline lengths help? How did that kind of work? Does like more close timelines kind of help to give you that, to lessen the distance between the spikes in productivity? Or how has your experience been with that?
So it's a really interesting subject, to be honest. And all of the questions that were asked are also really interesting. And I could spend literally probably an hour on every single question. I've been working with this for a long time and have got a lot of experience and a lot of opinions. In terms of the planning, yeah, I mean, I work in a relatively agile team as is. I mean, it's quite difficult for an IT support team to be agile at times because it's so reactive instead of proactive. But now that I've moved over to sort of content enablement is a little more proactive in terms of what we can do.
Sure.
And there's certainly something to be said for working in an agile fashion. The 30 centimeter metaphor that I shared, you can imagine the same thing, but split it down into 5 centimeter chunks, right? And work at 5 centimeter chunks. And all of a sudden the task looks much less daunting, but your deadlines also look much more daunting. But the research time also goes down. And it for me personally, it scales particularly well. But sometimes, I mean, I prefer the shorter form projects because it helps me. The short bursts of focus help me. But sometimes it's not possible. Sometimes you need to rewrite an entire knowledge base with 100 different documents, right?
Definitely. All right. I'm gonna let Ryan in. I just saw them pop up in our chat. Yeah, no, it's really interesting, right? The work does not always scale linearly. Hi, Ryan.
Hello.
All right. Well, since you showed up, I also wanted to kind of ask you a question here. A lot of people had a bunch of interesting conversation during your talk. I feel like the topic of documentation tooling is always an interesting one. And so yeah, I'm just curious a little bit more about to hear how kind of MarkDoc works kind of in the standard workflow. I think we had a lot of people asking like, how does it work in various editors? How does it work with IDEs? Do you have a little bit, is it just kind of like normal Markdown with like comments that the other stuff is kind of interpreted as, or how does that actually kind of work normally?
Yeah, so one of the reasons we wanted to extend Markdown is because there's such a large ecosystem of existing Markdown tooling. We wanted to be able to take advantage of the network effects there. So in a lot of places, it'll just treat the MarkDoc tags as though they are part of the text body, but everything else will work as you would expect. So for example, GitHub will render a rich text preview of the Markdown content, and you'll just see the tags and the text content. In Visual Studio Code, we have our own extension at Stripe that we've developed internally for highlighting and validation and a lot of other functionality. We're currently working on abstracting out some of that functionality. We're going to create a VS Code language service that we're going to release as open source at some point. So, I think for the rest of the tooling, I think it's coming.
Awesome. Yeah, no, it seems like that's one of the big benefits of kind of building on existing kind of an ecosystem, right? You're able to kind of build on top of the existing stuff and then maybe just add the syntax for your various pieces into your syntax highlighting. And I'm going to try to kind of alternate questions, though I realize the segues might be a little tricky here. I feel like we have like a pretty deeply technical talk and then a little bit more of a process and kind of mental health talk, really. And so, yeah, I did want to ask as well, back with you, Tyler, like, how does this kind of work in the real world with, I know people kind of had, how does the strategy work, for example, when taking into account, the fact that we all live in a workplace with constant interruption and and all that kind of stuff, like maybe your last 2 days of productivity get interrupted somehow. Have you found kind of issues there, or does it work pretty well in kind of that real world kind of job context, I guess?
For sure. I think one of the big drawbacks to my process is absolutely that, when if I know that my limit is a certain amount of documents per day, or I know how many sort of lines or paragraphs I can write in a day, and I sort of really squeeze that into the minimum amount of time possible, as I'm wont to do, and as so many other people with ADHD have told me that they do too. That capacity for distraction, or not even necessarily distraction, but when something comes up, right? Like, I don't know, maybe the fridge stops working, or there's a power cut or something, and all of a sudden you're just not able to work. It definitely has a really big impact there, and it's one of the biggest drawbacks that I find. And I try to be hyper aware of it and give myself as much room as possible, as much sort of maneuverability as possible, whilst also understanding that I have a process and I need to work in my process in order to get my best work out. And it's a fine balancing act, and one that even after 3 years, I'm not close to finding 100% perfection with it.
Well, and I think that's probably the reality for everybody, right? We all have our own productivity like methods that only work part of the time. I think that's, also kind of internalizing that is the case for everybody is super valuable, because there's no, perfectly efficient machine as human. And I guess to segue into that kind of workflow kind of productivity thing, I think a lot of people were really impressed with the MarkDoc, all the work that's there, kind of the deep thought that's gone into it. And I think people were just a little more curious about kind of what the team behind that looks like. What's the kind of resources that were kind of required to create such a well thought out tool? Like, what's the team look like, both kind of for MarkDoc itself, but then also, I mean, whenever we talk about Stripe Docs, people would ask about Stripe Docs. So just kind of the whole kind of Stripe Doc engineering team as well, people had questions about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course. So MarkDoc actually started out as a solo project. I created it myself. The team brought a lot of good ideas to the table when we were working on migrating the content over. And, of course, a lot of our custom tags and things like that are efforts from the Docs product engineering team. And then when we were preparing to open source it, 2 members of the team in particular really helped with a lot of the cleanup and refactoring and getting the APIs into a finalized state. As for the Stripe Docs product team, I believe we are 10 engineers. Then we also have an engineering manager. And we are currently looking to hire a product manager, which, so by the way, anybody who's watching, we have a job listing. But yeah, so we've a few of those are recent additions. But yeah, we did basically a complete rewrite of the Docs platform over the past 2 years with this team of 10.
Okay, yeah. So I mean, 2 years with 10 people, that's a pretty solid engineering effort, or that's a pretty substantial team. I think a lot of people, they're given the amount of people that are kind of in the solo writer reality, I imagine that is almost like an unfathomable amount of resource to put towards these projects.
Yeah, it was a big investment by the company. So when I started 6 years ago, there were 3 technical writers and no engineers. And so today, when we've created that team, it was a big swing.
Yeah, and I do think it's one of the things I mentioned in chat as well, right? Is like, if you're gonna, people are like, how do I get Stripe Docs on the cheap or whatever, right? They're like, oh, this is such a great example, and it's like, well, there's a lot of engineering, there's a lot of love that goes into that. I think your talk really covered that, the amount of work that goes into kind of the system and the history. I think somebody commented like, you're basically like, you end up building a whole CMS, right? You're kind of like, we're going to build a doc platform, and then it slowly kind of scales up. And I love that you all kind of stepped back and were like, let's think about this a little bit more. Let's rethink how we're approaching this in a way that, can both enable open source contribution, but then also, and allow us to have a little bit more foundation for our engineering. And maybe, the engineering time doesn't quite take as much in an ongoing fashion because we're architecting it properly. So I was curious, Tyler, this is a little outside of the scope, but you did mention kind of working at GitHub. So to kind of connect those dots, I was curious just to hear a little more about kind of how GitHub does documentation. And sorry if that's kind of outside of the scope of the talk, but I was just curious, I think that's another name that people look at and are really just curious what the workflow looks like. Would you be able to tell us a little more about kind of what your process looks like?
Yeah. So unfortunately, I can't really speak for like the docs.github.com team or the docs team at GitHub.
Okay, sure.
I write documents for the internal IT team. So I started with GitHub on the internal IT team as essentially just an employee IT support agent. And a lot of our knowledge was tribal knowledge within the team. And then over a relatively short period of time, all of the tribal knowledge disappeared, and the longest serving member on our team had been there for 18 months, and our documents were a little behind in terms of the internal and the IT to rest of company documentation. So a lot of those processes got lost, and we had to rebuild them from the ground up. And my job really came about because of that, and because of the need to preserve that knowledge for the future. So yeah, my entire job essentially was I was given a knowledge base that had been written over a period of about 5 to 6 years that didn't encompass all of the processes. It was written by 7 or 8 different contributors with 7 or 8 different ideas on structure and how content should be arranged and written, and 7 different voices really. And the biggest thing for me was I had to take a step back and look at the whole thing sort of as a holistic, or to take a more holistic approach and sort of take one level of abstraction upwards from this document needs updating, right? It's not just this document, it was the entire base.
Right, what's our process?
For sure. Yep. So I ended up for probably my first 6 months, I wrote very few documents because my entire time was focused solely on content strategy, creating a voice, creating templates and things like that. And creating a scalable structure for the future, right? And making sure that it was something that I could teach other people. So when my job is no longer around, I've said it before, as an IT support person, first and foremost, is where I spent 10 years of my career. A tech writer shouldn't really be needed for an internal IT team specifically, just for that team. Maybe as a wider function, as part of a wider function, right? But a full-time IT tech writer is a little over the top sometimes. And my entire aim is to make myself redundant, right? Build up an entire foundation of a knowledge base that can then be maintained in an easy fashion, and other people can be taught the way that it works very easily, without me having to be that sort of single point of contact, point of failure for those documents.
I feel like that story is as old as documentation, right? It's like, oh yeah, we don't write stuff down. People just know things. That's like, oh wait, everybody who do stuff is slowly quitting. Like, what do we do?
Absolutely.
That's really interesting, and yeah, I think that's a very classic story for a lot of people here, right? They're just really trying to solve their own problems, right? And kind of you end up in that. I think a lot of engineers end up in the role of building tooling because they want to solve their own problem, right? And I'm guessing that's how MarkDoc was, right? You're like, oh, these other tools are fine, but like I see a better way to do this. So I do think we're getting a little bit close to the end of our time. So I did want to go back to MarkDoc a little bit, which I think a lot of people had a bunch of kind of technical questions that I do think, if you go to the website and browse around, there's a bunch more information there. But I think people did have a question about kind of what that integration, like you mentioned, there's kind of an AST, there's multiple output formats, and there's like integration with React, all these kind of things. I think people are just curious a little bit more about kind of what the vision for that is. Like, how does it work exactly? Is it a static site with user side JS? Does it output a React app? Or, I think people were just like, there's a lot there. So just maybe unpacking that a little bit more.
Yeah. So I think there's also like people want to know, like, is it an end-to-end solution or whatnot? And it really isn't. Like, we built it as a component that you can drop into your site, so it does not handle routing or any of that. It doesn't act as a complete static site generator. What you get with what we've open sourced is the parser, the renderer, and the validator, and then you can kind of integrate that with whatever the rest of your stack is. And so there are third-party plugins, like we have a Next.js plugin that we've released to, and a boilerplate for it. So there are ways to get closer to a complete stack. As for the React integration, there are two different React renderers. One of them will output JavaScript code, so it kind of works like you're transpiling your document to JavaScript. And that's what we call our static renderer, is useful if you wanted to do like a static site kind of approach, or if you wanted to be able to build a Webpack plugin that can import a markdoc document as though it is a JavaScript module. Then there's the dynamic renderer, which it produces a JSON structure that can be converted into a React VDOM on the client side. And so that's what we use at Stripe. So we've kind of built the system around that. We use server-side React rendering with that approach.
So is that like a JSON representation of the AST that's then getting actually rendered via the front end, or I guess then rendered on the server into HTML and then sent to the browser?
Right, exactly. And so we actually have kind of two separate data structures. There's the document AST, and then we have what we call the render tree, which is the kind of the AST that you get after you've processed all of the document nodes. And it is like a JSON representation that's very close to like what the VDOM would look like. And so we have a very thin client part that just converts it to a React VDOM on the client.
Wow. So the AST is a little bit more kind of, there's like I've done a lot of this stuff in the Sphinx ecosystem, but right, there's kind of like the AST before you resolve references and do all that kind of, it's like, here's the input and what it's representing. And then it's like, okay, well, this reference is now resolved. So now we have a representation of that in the output that we can just render, and we don't have to have that resolution logic or whatever on the client side.
Right, exactly. And I think too, because we want to have the AST be rich enough that we can convert it back out into plain text representation, like the original markdoc source. It needs to have a lot of information in it. And also for validation debugging, we need to know like source mapping and things like that. And of course, you don't need any of that on the client. So the render tree is much thinner.
Right. Yeah. It's like we don't care about, there's no error messages on the client, hopefully, right?
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I think, unfortunately, that's all the time we have. I do think a lot of people were engaged really deeply with both of these talks, kind of both at a personal and a technical level. I think a lot of people were excited about just kind of the representation and just learning more about all the stuff that's going on in our documentation ecosystem. So we really appreciate both of you presenting and being here for the Q&A. And I do think there's a few extra questions here that didn't get answered in the chat. So definitely if you have a few more minutes to kind of drop some questions there. But otherwise, I guess I'm going to close the conference. So thank you all again for presenting. Thanks everybody for coming. And we will see you all again here in the future in Australia, Portland, or in Europe.